Hi, this is Paul, and we are continuing to read through and walk through the Heidelberg Catechism. Now, anybody who's listened to any of my sermons knows that the Catechism is organized as misery, deliverance, gratitude. Sometimes people in my youth would say sin, salvation, service. I never really liked that formulation because deliverance is very, very broad. Heidelberg Catechism was written at a time when the dominant spoken preoccupation of most people was, how can I secure for myself a blessed afterlife, given the fact that life in this world is short, unstable, and brutal. And so Heidelberg Catechism was written in Germany around in the time of the fairly early Reformation, 1560s, and they're trying to deliver for people what today might be called, in some Protestant doctrinal circles, assurance of salvation. What the deliverance section intends to do is give to the people a sense of how Jesus dying on the cross resolves their problem of eternal damnation. That was a dominant anxiety for many people of the day. That is not a dominant anxiety for as high a percentage of the population today. I'm not saying it's an unimportant anxiety, but what I'm saying is that the Catechism is designed to try to answer the question, how does Jesus dying on the cross mean I share in participation in a blessed afterlife rather than an afterlife of punishment and damnation? That's what the Catechism is designed to do. Now, that's a good thing, because the truth is, many people need that and want that. We live in an age when many people, because of our affluence and the relative success of many of the nations that we live in, the success of modern medicine, a century or so ago, and definitely 2 centuries ago, most people would lose a child to death before the age of 5. I remember doing a class in the Dominican Republic where I just asked the class, how many of you have ever lost a child under the age of 5? Every hand went up in the class. If I were to do a similar thing in my church, I'm hard-pressed to think of one. What does that mean? Anxiety about the afterlife, by virtue of the culture we live in, is not what it was in the 16th century in Europe. And this is by virtue of a variety of circumstances. That doesn't mean that I don't find on a very regular basis a good number of people, whether they were raised in the church or not, as they're getting older, anxious about what happens after they die. It's a common pastoral question. And the Heidelberg Catechism, I think, nicely addresses those questions with some very nice formulations to try to connect the sacrifice of Jesus Christ with an assurance that after I die, I will live with him and good things will come to me. Now, I don't believe that the Bible or the Catechism really leaves the rest of the picture unaddressed. What is the rest of the picture? I'll often get questions from people, okay, so Jesus died on the cross, and Christians say he was bodily resurrected out of the tomb, that disciples touched his flesh, that he ate fish, that he ascended into heaven. So what? What are some of the issues that people struggle with today? Will humanity extinguish itself in a great nuclear war? And anything I've ever worked on or towards today, or anything that I will ever love, will it simply be extinguished? Today we have something of a meaning crisis. And John Vervaeke, I think, has nicely formulated this. Today we live in a society which is not heavily dominated by concerns about the judgment of God, much more dominated about the value of my life here and now, if in fact a generation or two after I die, no one will know or care about me. And imagine from a naturalist, materialist perspective, at some point this grand show of humanity is going to end, meaning that nothing we've ever done, not the joy, not the sufferings, will ever mean a thing, because they won't be sort of held in consciousness by an observer. Now, philosophers have talked about these kinds of issues for a very long time, and there are a lot of things that you can discuss with respect to these things. In many respects, the Bible holds out a vision that people are deeply attracted to. You mean, not only do I have the possibility of not having my conscious existence extinguished after I die, but that in fact many of the bodily pleasures which I now enjoy, I might in fact get to continue to enjoy. There was one dear saint in this church who, as he was dying, even before he was dying, he and I would have this conversation regularly. And he, in fact, used to be an elder in the church, and he would teach catechism. And he was getting up in age. He wasn't in good health. And he would often say to me, "I don't want to die." Why not? Because I love having lunch with you. I enjoy music. I enjoy my wife. I enjoy my home. I enjoy my family. I enjoy dogs. I find so much enjoyment in this world. And I could say to him, I believe all of those gifts that are given to you in this world are just signposts to gifts that will be given in the next. Friendship, food, the images in the Bible about the life in the new heavens and the new earth are evocative with these kinds of things. Now, someone might say, well, these are just the kinds of images you would tell people because this is what we can relate to. True, but we're always limited to that. We're always limited to only what we can relate to. So that's not really sort of a fair dodge, because the truth is, well, many, many cultures have images of an afterlife, and colloquially you have things like the happy hunting ground or nirvana or Valhalla, where the great heroes fight battles every day, die, and are risen to fight again. They love fighting so much they get to do it every day ad infinitum. And that, of course, then sets up the whole idea that you hear fairly regularly in our culture that everlastingness is not a good thing because we would get bored. Because no matter how good the pleasures are of this world, we would get bored. And it's kind of like, okay, but I'm not sure you really know that. Because the truth is that many people in this world who learn how to live well, sure, they get tired and weary, and usually by the time we get old, we get tired and weary of being sick and old. The world seems to be the kind of place that, for many joys, they are not ultimate, but they don't necessarily have the kind of bottom that we worry about. Now, it's true, if I were to eat lobster every day of the week, I would probably get sick of it. That's true. But there isn't just lobster to eat. And it also seems the case that even with the resources of this world, for those who enjoy eating and cooking and flavor, I don't know that we've ever exhausted the capacity of the human taste palate. So, what makes you think that we're going to run out? In the Heidelberg Catechism, misery is easy. Misery is easy because this world can be miserable. And anyone who hangs around this world long enough will learn misery. And the Heidelberg Catechism, again, locates the source of our misery in ourselves. We can't really blame someone else for our miseries. And now, this is often the case that there are plenty of other things to blame for particular miseries. But even in a place like the United States, and even for people who really don't have an ongoing anxiety about shelter over their head or food on their table, or medications to dull the pain of illnesses that might assail us, many of the miseries that we have do come from ourselves. And as a pastor, pastoring in a really remarkable place and time, I see this often. People are miserable because they don't know how to behave. They don't know how to love each other well, and they don't know how to love God. Now, last week, I talked about, what was the title of last week's? Almost everyone has a sense that right and wrong can be expressed by debt. Again, the Heidelberg Catechism, written during the Reformational period, wanted to address a logic for how people could imagine that the death of Jesus on a cross would pay the debt of their sin. And again, that idea of debt was deep within their culture. You had saints who had merits. You had a pope who could assign merits, the excess merits of the saints, and by virtue of indulgences, offer them to Christians. Now again, the Pope, in terms of getting people out of purgatory quickly, everyone in purgatory is going to make it to heaven, let's say. We'll use that language. But it's just a matter of paying off their debts early. And so the reformers were looking to stand against that particular system and talk about the fact that we're not going to basically run sin accounting here. We're going to use Jesus as basically the ultimate debt reliever, and our connection with Jesus as satisfying the debt. Now, there are a lot of people that today it's rather popular in some places that they don't like the idea of a satisfaction theory, a debt satisfaction theory of atonement. The truth is that now when I talk about atonement, I talk about how can God and humanity be reconciled. And there are a number of theories of atonement. And all of these theories of atonement, what they try to do is give a verbal picture to understand a relationship that is not always easy to understand. And so if you have a relationship that is not easy to understand, we often give analogies or pictures. And I find this pattern to be inescapable. In almost every day when we are trying to discuss relationships between large immaterial things, we almost always have to use analogies. It's exaptation. We take what we know sort of at a very low physical cause and effect level, and we sort of project it up to have an understanding about how things might be working at a different level. And this is something we are not about to stop doing. And so Lord's Day 5 talks about punishment and payment. Lord's Day 6 begins to get into the question of a mediator. Now, you might notice that in some ways the analogy has shifted slightly, because before we were sort of looking at a debt that needed to be paid. Now, in some ways, we're looking at a relationship that needs to be mended. There are two parties in this relationship, and they have, well, there are claims being made that one party has wronged the other party. And so what is imagined is that, well, often in a case like this, when the situation is intractable, a mediator is helpful to help bridge the gap. Lord's Day question answer 15 sort of sets this up. What kind of mediator and deliverer should we look for then? One who is a true and righteous human, yet more powerful than any creatures. One that is true and also God. Why must the mediator be a true and righteous human? Well, to understand what a mediator does, a mediator sort of has to stand between. Now, in a sermon a couple Sundays ago, I preached on the golden calf episode in Israel's desert wanderings. And the golden calf episode is a remarkable story where God and Israel are out of sorts, and Moses is the mediator. And it's a delightful story in many ways because God is seen as, in some ways, very human in terms of his reaction to Israel's rebellion. His feelings are hurt, he is angry, he is offended, and he sort of talks to Moses like a husband and wife talk about a child. Now again, that is an analogy. Israel is not Moses' child. But Moses has sort of been a midwife. Moses has sort of been a wife. Moses has been a partner with the Lord in bringing Israel out of Egypt, as has Aaron. And of course, Aaron stumbles terribly. And so the Lord from Sinai basically says, this covenant that I just wrote up, they haven't even agreed to it, and they're already breaking it. Aaron made a golden calf, and they're basically having a really wild party down there in the camp. Stand back, Moses. I'm going to burn them out, and we'll start over with you. And Moses stands in the gap. And the Lord says basically, your people that you brought out of Egypt, says this to Moses. Moses turns it around and said, oh no, Lord, these are your people. You brought them out of Egypt, and you don't really want the whole world to say, well, this is a God who can clearly push other gods around. But what he can't do is really save. If you go back to that sermon, I end that sermon talking about what we really need is a new heart. Because it's amazing in this story of Israel and God and Moses that the gods of Egypt are not a big deal. Plagues, water to blood, gnats, frogs, darkness, killing the firstborn. All these the Lord can just do. But when it comes to dealing with us, without killing us, we're not so easy. We have issues. Earlier in Misery, the Catechism said, well, I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. It's one thing to kill a human being. It's a wholly other thing to change a human being's heart. Now, Moses will stand in the gap, and God will pull back from this threat. But Moses will go down, and the Levites will be called to his side, and they will cut down 3,000, and there will be a plague, and more Israelites will die. And then they're sorry. But they're sorry for a while. The patterns just repeat themselves. It's relatively easy to scare human beings into immediate initial compliance. Movies are full of putting a gun to someone's head and having them go somewhere or say something or do something. You can look at the Vietnam War hostage tapes with Marines signaling SOS with their eyes, and everybody knows that confessions that have been tortured out of someone shouldn't be valid in court. You can coerce and scare people, but that's not the kind of relationship that anyone wants. And so what we actually need is a mediator and someone who can stand between us. Now, Moses, in the story in Exodus 32 to 34, is an amazing mediator. But Moses doesn't really absorb the punishment of God. The punishment of God flows through him and the Levites as they kill 3,000 Israelites that day. Why must the mediator be a true and righteous human? God's justice demands that human nature, which has sinned, must pay for sin. But a sinful human could never pay for others. So the idea here is that, well, if we need new hearts, we need to have a mediator who is at least no longer contributing to the problem. And so we want a mediator that is human, because otherwise, in many ways, the entire project will seem unbelievable. I've never met a perfect human being. The Catechism says that's because we have a problem of human nature. And this human nature problem leads to this natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. And this human nature problem leads to misery. And so it's really important to have a human being that doesn't do what we do. Because in many ways, human beings can try to make up for others, and human beings do try to pay for others. You can read A Tale of Two Cities, classic story of one man giving his life for a friend. And we love those stories. Those stories inspire us when we see them. Those stories are downstream from this story, of course, the story of Jesus. So the mediator should be a human. Must be a human, the Catechism says. Why must the mediator also be true God? So that the mediator, by the power of his divinity, might bear the weight of God's wrath in his humanity. Now this is where Jesus and Moses, they come apart. Moses brings God's wrath down the mountain. Now, the wrath is diminished, but he still brings the wrath. Jesus bears God's wrath, and that's where we get back into this image of debt and payment. So the Catechism is continuing to use that metaphor as it goes through here. But it goes further than that. It's not just paying a debt, because the funny thing about this investment is that, let's imagine that squatters have broken into a rental property that you own, and they are living in that property. And while they are living in that property, they are degrading that property. They are using that property for a drug house. What is required? Well, the squatters have to leave. There should be some semblance of punishment. We all sort of understand that. They should at least have to pay for damages, but generally speaking, squatters have no money to pay said damages. And then the house has to be restored. So not only does the loss have to be made up, but the intended mission and purpose of the house needs to be achieved for the squatter tragedy to be finally and irrevocably laid aside. So not only must this mediator bear the wrath of God, but the mediator must even rehab the house, and rehab the house in a way that squatters will no more settle in and do drugs, and earn for us and restore us righteousness and life. Now, these are very few words, but they are very big words, because the Heidelberg Catechism is not just talking about debt payment or trying to use the metaphor of accounting for sin. The Heidelberg Catechism is talking about restoration. Now, I've lived 61 years now, and I've been sinning a long time, and some of my sins you'll never know, and some of my sins, for those who know me, you have some sense of. There are sins that I have done that have damaged other people. And there's no possible way I can undo those damages. It is simply beyond me. And when I think about what could undo those damages, I can think about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and think, could Captain America undo those damages? How about the biggest one? How about, we'll go from Marvel to DC. How about Superman? Could Superman undo those damages? We live in a world and in a time when damages done in the past are seldom able to be recouped, not by any human effort and not by any effort we can usually imagine. We need someone who can not only pay the debt, but we need someone who can somehow restore and make up for all of the loss that has come. And Christians have been talking about this for a very long time. Now, it's actually a very difficult thing to address in a straightforward way. It's easy to say, make up for a long time. But to say it in a way that sort of has the emotional impact that such a grand idea is worth, that usually involves pictures and images. And Christians for a long time have been imagining how terrible loss can be undone. A book that is a favorite in the Christian Reformed Church, The Hiding Place, is the story of Corrie ten Boom. Now, for many in this world, Tom Holland is right that Nazis have sort of replaced Satan as the great evil, and the Holocaust is the world's greatest evil that's ever been done. Well, the truth is that the Holocaust is one example of the kinds of horrible evil that human beings have been doing for a very long time, and there are many, 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 many other kinds of evil that human beings participate in and contribute to throughout world history beyond the massacre of 6 million Jews and another 6 million Slavs and other people. But Corrie ten Boom was a Dutch woman who hid Jews, and they were discovered, and she and her beloved sister were sent to a death camp. And she loved her sister. She was a single woman. She loved her sister. Her sister was in many ways her favorite person in the world. For whatever reason, Corrie was a little bit more hardy, could survive the death camp, but her sister was a little more frail. And she watched the abuse and the degradation of her sister. And she watched the guards enjoy it. And she was bitter, and she was angry, and she had a right to be. We all get that. Sometimes people are so, you have to understand that all of this talk of justice does not undermine the reality that there's a debt to pay. And of course, she would remember these guards. The war would end. She survived. She would become a lay preacher, an evangelistic preacher, and she would go around war-torn Germany preaching the love of Jesus. And of course, after a big event, people would want to come up and give their personal well wishes and thanks and say a personal word. And one time, to her horror, she sees a guard she recognizes from her camp that was particularly brutal against her and her sister. And this guard comes up to her, bubbling about the grace and mercy of Jesus. She wasn't feeling it. But she knew enough to know that she herself was a sinner too, and that Jesus had paid her debt. And so she prays a little prayer. Lord, I can't do this. You will have to give me the power. And she feels an energy go through her body, and she shakes his hand, and she forgives him. Now, you might imagine that even though the guard in no way could ever make up for her beloved sister's death, forgiveness was the proper path forward. But how can restoration take place? This kind of thinking boggles our mind. We struggle with categories to consider it. We need a mediator. He must be human. He must be God. Then who is this mediator? True God and at the same time a true and righteous human. Our Lord Jesus Christ, who was given to us to completely deliver us and make us right with God. The mediator comes in and brings reconciliation between the parties. Well, how do you come to know this? The Holy Gospel tells me. God began to reveal the gospel already in paradise. Genesis 3:15. I wonder where these links go. Let's click on them and see. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. Later, God proclaimed it to the holy patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and foreshadowed it, Moses, David, Abraham, by the sacrifices and other ceremonies of the law, the Passover lamb, the sacrifices in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And finally, God fulfilled it. I often say in communion that the sacrifices were the interest payment, and Jesus comes and pays the principal through his own beloved Son. Now, this is one way to tell the story. There are other metaphors to use, and the Bible has many of them. And there are other stories that foreshadow the story, and stories after, like the Corrie ten Boom story, that give us an image of the story. But it's all pointing to the same thing, because we not only want somehow the damage that we've done in the past to be undone. And now, Corrie does not get her sister back in that moment. She will miss her sister for the rest of her life. The prison guard will probably bear the guilt of what he did and feel that at times for the rest of his life. But the story of Corrie forgiving him is a story that excites, inspires, and thrills, because it brings us to imagine, maybe, just maybe, the evil we do can be brought to good. One of the best examples of this I preached not too long ago is the story of Joseph. And there are just generations of family dysfunction that goes into the calamity of Joseph's own brothers deciding that, there's no money in murder, so let's sell him. And he's sold into Egypt, and calamity after calamity, but all along the way, God uses him so that not only Israel and the nations around Egypt would be saved from the tragedy of the drought, but him and his brothers could be reconciled. Joseph sums it up at the end of the book of Genesis. His brothers are anxious because, well, surely he's just been holding back because daddy's been alive, and now that Jacob has died, now he's going to torture us and make us pay for what we did. And Joseph says, you meant it for evil. But the evil you did, God was able to use it to save the world. Now, that's a great salvation story. And it's not a salvation story about afterlife. It's a salvation story about the here and now. And this deliverance is so big, it's both about the here and now and about the life of the age to come. It's anticipated salvation and it's realized salvation. All of our salvations in this world are not fully realized. We anticipate the fulfillment of that. But it's, to me, clear to see that no power on earth can finally do this. Our mediator needs to be human and needs to be divine. That is Lord's Day 7. Lord's Day 6. All right. Hope that works for you.